this session, but my clock is showing 2 o'clock, so I'll get us started. Many thanks for joining today and welcome. Welcome to the first day of the Nordic EdTech Bootcamp. We are delighted that so many of you can join live today, and we look forward to sharing the session also as a recording with those who registered but could not join today. My name is Natalia Ingebretsen-Kuchirkova. I work as research professor at the University of Stavanger in Norway, and also as CEO or managing director for WICIT, which is a network of learning scientists and researchers supporting EdTech companies to be evidence-based. WICIT organized this bootcamp with the intention to promote the great work that is happening in the Nordic countries in the EdTech space, and to raise awareness about the importance of collaboration between academia and industry. We believe that it is essential that researchers, teachers, or educators and EdTech developers work together in scaling good solutions for children. So I'm delighted that so many of you coming from the different sectors are joining today. It is this kind of collaborative and really egalitarian approach that we wish to celebrate and showcase during the 4 days of bootcamp. We hope to emphasize innovation in the area. So as you would have seen on the program, we have several examples of innovation that is happening in the Nordic EdTech space. Today, the program is to start with myself, a short intro, and that will be followed with Eglantine Dupuy, who is an innovation analyst at the intelligence unit at Dealroom, followed up by Jonathan Viner, who is the chief editor of the Nordic EdTech News and also the director of 10 Digits. Then we'll take a short break and we'll have Sigdugel from Picatil. And after that, we'll hear a little bit more about LearnLab from Yngve. If you are joining tomorrow, we encourage you to also join our friends at EdTech Denmark, who are running a pitch event and who would like to extend their invitation to anyone who would like to know more specifically about EdTech Denmark. But today, as I said, we'll start with an overview about what is happening in the Nordic EdTech space by Eglantine Dupuy, who will share the work that has been done at Dealroom and specifically talk about a report that came out and was very exciting to read in terms of the overview of the funding landscape in Nordic EdTech. So I'll stop sharing now. And Eglantine, if you would like to come next.
Okay, hi everyone. I'll just put it in full screen. Okay, so as Natalia said, I'm going to share with you a few insights on what's happening in the Nordics and the EdTech industry. Oh, wait.
These small arrows down on the screen.
No. Oh, there we go. Sorry. So this is what we'll cover today, just to introduce myself a little bit, even though Natalia already did. My name is Eglantine. As you can hear, I'm French. And I'm part of the intelligence unit at Dealroom, which means that basically we try to grab insights from our database, which tracks company data. We try to focus on early stage European startups, but also track other companies that are in the tech space, and their funding rounds to then be able to produce insights in a lot of different industries and ecosystem, some of which is, of course, education and, of course, the Nordics. So just to kind of explain how we do things at Dealroom, just so you understand a little bit the methodology of this report. So we have a bunch of companies, of course, and we try to categorize them. The highest level is by industry. So what we consider EdTech is anything under education, because we only concern ourselves with tech companies. We have this outside tech filter that we put to filter out any non-tech companies. So what you see in Dealroom as education is always EdTech. And then, of course, we have sub-industries, which, as you can assume, are proper to each industry. For education, that is education management. So that's more about the operation side of things. So for stakeholders like teachers or universities, things like that. Then we have education providers who actually provide content and create content for the learning and training. And lastly, learning tools and resources that help with the learning process. Here you can see the tags, which we use to categorize companies further. In education, we separated it into two buckets, the age group and the product type. So who's the customer markets, and then how is the product delivered, and how is it intended to be used, things like that. And lastly, we pride ourselves on having a lot of impact data, and we base ourselves on the UN's Sustainable Development Goals for education. That can be, there's a few options. Sometimes it's gender equality or reduce inequalities, but the most relevant one is, of course, the 14th goal, quality education. So going into the findings, when we look at all of the industries funded in the Nordics in the past 5 years, education ranks 10th, with 1.1 billion being raised across the past 5 years. Sorry. Can you still see it now?
Yeah, all good.
Okay, sorry. And so in terms of value, by the end of the year, we're expected that EdTech companies in the Nordics amount to 6 billion. And we can see that that's quite a drop from the peak of 2021, where, of course, the market was very different and a lot of value was being created. But that's still a rebound from the past years, which is not the case for every industry. So it's important to note. And when we look at where most of that value is created, which are the companies that create that value, over half of it is from companies founded in between 2010 and 2014. Here you have some examples of a few companies created in those cohorts. Of course, the growth is bigger for 2005 to 2009 companies, but that's important to note that it was a big change, but they don't amount to a lot. The main companies were built in that timeline, 2010 to 2014. In terms of total VC funding, so by year's end, we're expected to have 120 million being put into Nordic EdTech companies. So of course, we can see a big decline from the past years. Every year it's been declining quite a lot, 62% from the peak. However, it's important to see that we're not exactly we're above pre-2020 levels, which is an important distinction. And lastly, we see that there's no rounds past Series Bs this year, so no large rounds, only smaller rounds. When we look at what's the share of the Nordics, what do they make up in the global landscape and in the European landscape? A peak was in 2020 with 31% of total European EdTech funding going to the Nordics. That has dropped down to 13% since. That's still a good share. However, on the global landscape, it's only 3%. When we look on a country-by-country basis, in terms of the European landscape, the Nordics are almost all in the top 10, except Iceland, but that's of course a very small market. Norway is the most funded of the Nordics, and it's important to see that we have growth in Norway and in Sweden. in the past year, which is not the case for every country as well. So important to note. So now looking at specific trends. So here are the sub-industries that I mentioned earlier. So education management was the top funded in 2023. And that's not been the case in the past years. And this year we can see a massive growth compared to last year, but that's largely attributable to a few big rounds. Some of the top rounds, here are the top rounds of the EdTechs in the Nordics, and the second, third, and fourth were in education management, so that explains the large growth. And learning tools and resources is right after, close after, but the others have been showing quite a decline in comparison. So looking more granularly at some trends, in the past 5 years, it's mainly been K-12 and higher education companies that were getting most funding, but that's not been the case at all this year. We can see no funding went to higher education companies or specific companies, and only 5 million to K-12, whereas corporate learning actually made a big jump this year. Yeah. And when we ask ourselves, so where is that funding coming from? Who is allocating that capital? We see that actually the top investors are coming from Asia and the US, and Nordics only fund 25% of their own edtech companies in terms of funding amounts. But when we look at the number of rounds, there are a lot more present. Here are the top investors in this industry in the Nordics, and only all but one are Nordics. So the conclusion here is basically that Nordic investors participate to a lot of rounds, but don't allocate big amounts of capital. So lastly, I wanted to talk a little bit about a specific company, which I know that you all know, but I thought maybe I could bring a little bit more insights into it with a few numbers. So of course, I looked into unicorns, and there's only one EdTech Nordic unicorn, and that is Kahoot, which obviously everybody knows. But yeah, a little bit about its history. So it was launched in December 2011. It's actually a spin-out from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, because it was stemmed from academic research. And a fun fact is that it has 5 co-founders, which is not very common, so it sparked my interest. And then in October 2019, so right before COVID, they actually IPO'd at 500 million valuation. And during COVID, they, of course, reaped a lot of benefits, unlike many other industries. I mean, obviously, everything was digital, online learning, myself included. I finished university and during COVID. And so actually, they gained a lot from it. They actually, in 2020, had a revenue of close to $50 million, which was a 250% growth from the previous year, which is really big. And they managed to have over 50 million recurring users every month, spread out across 200 countries, which is a very global reach. Recently, they were acquired for 1.7 billion in August of this year, and they reached unicorn status. And today they're worth even more. They're worth 2 billion, which makes them not only one of the 9 Norwegian unicorns, but also the second most valuable Norwegian companies of all time, or currently. And I looked a bit at their acquisition. So they actually bought 7 companies, most of which were in the Nordics and most of which were edtechs. But not all of them, some were for their operations. But I think it's important to look at the impact that companies can have. And on that topic, I looked a bit at the companies that came out of Kahoot, or not really came out, but the alumni founders. So that's something that happens a lot, usually with unicorns, but also other companies that do well, other startups. people that work at this company, they go on to fund their own companies. So just looking at a few examples, most of which are based in Oslo, which is really good for fostering its own ecosystem. So here there's a few companies. So there's even the company that we have a speaker after, but yeah, it's interesting to see what was founded, and these are just edtechs. I found a lot more that were in other industries. Of course, that's not what we're dealing with today, but it's interesting to see that a lot can come out from just one company, and I recommend that you go look a bit into depth into each of them. Their own, most of them are pretty early stage and very different. I found it interesting that, for example, the Weeble rates is by an old Kahoot engineer, so it's a lot more technical, whereas Megalearn, it's by an old designer at Kahoot, so it's a lot more about storytelling and visuals, etc. So yeah, I'll let you look into that by yourself. And lastly, this is just if you scan the QR code, you can look at our EdTech ecosystem. I can show you here, for example. So we have our normal Dealroom database, and then we have a few that are specific per industry, where there's some like pre-filters that are sponsored, etc. So just to show you really quickly, just in case you've never used Dealroom. So for example, here it's going to be pre-filtered for education. Here we can look at the sub-industry. If I only want to have the Nordics, I can do that, etc. Or here you can look at the funding round. So this is the global funding amounts for all of EdTech across the years. So yeah, there's a lot that you can do here. That's just a few examples. And lastly, I'm going to share with you this link because I know a lot of you are founders. Basically, we have a free account for 3 months for founders, just so that you can claim your profile and add all the information so that you can be a lot more visible to investors and have more complete information. And we also post jobs, so that's also one way to use it. And yeah, that's it for me. I'll send the link in the chat.
That was fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing these insights with us, Eglantine. I was quite interested in hearing what you said, that many Nordic investors participate in these rounds, but don't tend to invest so much in the end. That I didn't know. So do you have a hypothesis why that is the case?
I mean, I think it's just because there's a lot more capital usually, and I mean, we're comparing the Nordics with the US or Asia. That's like very big buckets, and they're a lot more used to giving capital in the past years, you know. Correct.
Yes. And so nice to for you to include Kahoot, because they'll be our speaker tomorrow. Louisa Rosenheck will be talking about the sort of learning perspective they have. So very nice to see them highlighted as a unicorn, as you say, which is very unusual. Okay, I don't think we have any more questions other than people being very keen to get these both recordings and the slides to get shared afterwards. So we'll figure out a system so that we can share with both the attendees and people who registered and are not live attending today. But I see that there are many EdTech founders who registered, so I'm sure your information would be useful to them. Thanks very much, Eglantine. We'll move to Jonathan Viner now, who's been monitoring this EdTech space for us, both in terms of the Nordic EdTech news and also in your capacity of 10 digits. And you probably found a report both from Dealroom and HolonIQ interesting, Jonathan, right? So
fascinating stuff. That's great to see, and thank you, Eglantine, for that summary. It's excellent to see.
Wonderful. So Jonathan, please take us through the Nordic EdTech space as you see it.
Okay, I'll just, let me just share my screen.
Yeah.
Okay, Natalia, just let me know that you can see everything.
Yeah, it's all working. Perfect.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be with you this afternoon. And Natalia, thank you again for giving me an opportunity to talk to everybody about the Nordic EdTech landscape. I guess I'm going to talk about three core areas. I'm going to talk about the reasons why I believe that the Nordic EdTech environment and the Nordic EdTech ecosystem is the world's coolest and best. I'm going to try and identify some of the reasons I believe why that ecosystem and why the companies within it are quite so unique and have been quite successful in growing and scaling and building international businesses. And I'm also just going to touch on some of the current kind of big themes and topics and trends that are impacting Nordic EdTech at the moment. I haven't had time, unfortunately, to kind of digest the PISA results which came out today, but yeah, you mentioned my newsletter. There will be more on that in my newsletter on Monday. And you're probably wondering, why is this guy who doesn't, apart from the beard, look or sound particularly Nordic? Why is he telling us about this this amazing ecosystem? So let's address that elephant in the room. I am British, but live and work in the north of Sweden. My wife works in the Swedish school system. We've lived here for 5 years, and in that time, I've worked with and consulted and advised with some of these organizations here, public and private companies leading the future of learning and education across the Nordics. And as Natalia mentioned, I also put together a free fortnightly roundup called Nordic EdTech News, which is a summary of everything that's going on across the ecosystem. So if you are interested in the Nordics as a territory for potential expansion, then please do subscribe. It's free. You can find it on Substack. It's an easy, I'll drop the link into the chat afterwards. But enough about me. Let's talk about the Nordics in a little bit more detail. And I'm just going to start by kind of detailing what I identified the Nordics to be. So for me, the Nordics is made up of 8 countries. So just to be absolutely kind of clear, those 8 countries are Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Iceland, Latvia, Lithuania, Norway, and Sweden. I hope I've remembered all 8. But so they are the kind of traditional 5, but with 3 new Baltic additions. And I'm not going to go into complicated, what is the Nordics, what is Scandinavia, where does Scandinavia end and the Nordics begin? That's far too complicated. But so let's just assume that my focus is on those 8 countries. If we take them together as a landmass, they are the 7th largest nation on Earth, although home to only 33 million people, so relatively small and sparsely populated. Significant economic kind of weight and power. They would be collaboratively the 12th largest economy in the world. And there are a number of areas in which the 8 countries kind of work closely together on political issues, on geopolitical issues. The 8 countries have been particularly kind of coherent and cohesive in responding to the war in Ukraine, for instance, and will continue to work across this kind of Nordic Baltic 8, and will continue to be a vehicle for innovation and expansion of the ecosystem moving forward. So that's my kind of scope. That is what I define the Nordics to be and to include. So why do I believe that these 8 countries are the world's coolest EdTech ecosystem? If you look at what makes a successful and essential ecosystem, then all of the research identifies these 5 things. So the ecosystem has to have companies that are leading the way. It has to have a kind of community feel, and Natalia's already touched on that already. It needs to have access to funding, and we've already heard about funding, so I'm not going to kind of talk about that in further detail. I will point you towards the great work of Dealroom and the research and report that Eglantine's already shared with us. It needs support, and it needs opportunities for testing. So let's just jump through those in brief, kind of as a first off. Of course, the Nordics has some big companies that everybody working in EdTech will have heard of. We've already heard about Kahoot. You will have heard about companies like Lego, of course. You will have heard about Inspera. You would have heard of Labster. You would have heard of Sonoma Learning. There are some significant international players that are active across Nordic and Baltic EdTechs and that were founded and still are headquartered in our countries. But below that, there is a thriving ecosystem of much smaller startup companies. And for anybody interested in this space, I would push you towards this report from Holon IQ, which came out at the end of last week, identifying the kind of 50 leading startups across the Nordic and Baltic territories. And if you search for this on the Holon IQ website, there's lots of kind of detailed insight to go into there. I will just make three kind of key points here. The first is that the vast over 50% of these are focused on K-12. Focusing on traditional compulsory education has historically been and continues to be a strength of the Nordic and Baltic ecosystems, and the ecosystem and schools within it and higher education and vocational education institutions are well served by existing national players in these markets. If you look at the kind of national composition of these companies, then over half come from three countries, from Finland, from Norway, and from Sweden. So that's perhaps not surprising. They are by population the largest, but Finland, Norway, and Sweden are the kind of biggest contributors here, although this does represent companies from each of the eight countries across the ecosystem. And I think if you look at the kind of business models which predominate, selling B2B is absolutely the kind of predominant focus for Nordic and Baltic companies. Whether that B2B customer is a school or a university or a corporate will depend on their particular focus. But you can see here a significant focus around companies in that workforce and skills training space. The second point here is around community, and it's slightly unfortunate timing here that I mentioned the Helsinki Education Hub, whose funding I think has been kind of stopped, but this was prepared in advance of that announcement at the end of play yesterday. But there is a significant weight of work that takes place across the 8 countries to pull together this Nordic and Baltic community. Each of the countries has its own national EdTech association. So if you are interested in looking at these countries, then do explore them, do explore becoming a member and the research that they put out. There are a number of accelerators and incubators. Natalia has mentioned one in Denmark already. XEDU is another one in Finland. There are a significant number of meetups, hackathons, opportunities to get the community together to work on and to address topical issues. There are significant events set in Sweden, Educa in Finland, Encool in Norway, and Lærfest in Denmark, similar exhibitions to BET and opportunities to talk to your potential school-based stakeholders. There are a number of online communities, and yes, modestly, there's a well-written fortnightly free newsletter you should all subscribe to. Also, of course, there is a significant degree of support, and this is in Danish, for which I apologize, but this shows the kind of operating model of EdTech Denmark, and that operating model, I think, highlights how much of Nordic EdTech works. So in the top left-hand corner, you have learning institutions, education institutions. In the top right-hand corner, that circle is the EdTech businesses, companies working in that space. And at the bottom is local government, NGOs, and kind of organizations that are also involved in education. And this triple helix approach that EdTech Denmark pioneer, but which others use, kind of brings together all elements and helps to ensure that the resources that companies are building and developing are right and appropriate for schools, and that kind of set, or higher education institutions, and that those products and therefore are really meeting the needs of their intended audiences. And that also links to this point around testing. Again, I would urge anybody looking at the Nordic or Baltic environment to check out the network of test beds across those countries, whether that's EdTest Estonia, whether it's Swedish EdTest, whether it's the work of Testbed Helsinki. There are a number of vibrant communities that enable companies looking to move into the Nordic territories to test their products, to build and co-create and develop their products with practitioners, again, to ensure that they are relevant, right, and appropriate for use in the intended educational setting. And Natalia, I'm sure, will talk about impact. You need to test this. You need to test stuff in the environment in which it's being used, and then iterate and change and build and develop in accordance with the feedback you get from actual practitioners. And the Nordics, I would suggest, is one of the leading ecosystems for prioritizing testing, but also prioritizing that co-creation, working with organizations, working with education institutions to build and develop products that work. Okay, so that's a little bit about the ecosystem. Let's just try and highlight some of the reasons why I believe Nordic EdTech is so unique. And I think the first and most important thing to say is that I believe that the Nordics is unlike any other ecosystem around the world in that it is actually grounded on what you might call traditional Nordic values. And I think this underpins so much of education in all its settings that it's delivered across our countries, but also in the nature of the businesses that are built and developed. And I think underpinning it all is this quote, a cultural mindset that's centered not only on excellence in education, but that also has the drive to give students equal access to that education. So if you look at the last PISA results and look at where there is high quality of educational performance and where there is high equality or equity of outcome, there is a remarkable cluster in the top right-hand corner of this graph. Yes, Estonia is out in front, and they've kept their kind of position as the highest performing European country in today's PISA results. But in that top right-hand quadrant, you have Estonia, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland. There is a huge focus. No other regional ecosystem has that kind of focus of high quality and high equality of educational outcome and educational provision. And I think that therefore drives the businesses within it to achieve and to really push themselves to develop solutions that help build on that in both perspectives. And I think moving forwards, this is a recent quote from Finland's Minister of Education at the recent UNESCO Digital Learning Week. And I would draw two kind of key points out from this. The first is about looking at marginalization. And one of the key things that does come out from today's PISA results in, I think, all of the Nordic countries is a kind of broadening of a gap between haves and have-nots, and which countries and governments are focused on addressing. But I think this second sentence here, that teachers need to be engaged to ensure that pedagogy, to ensure that their role is at the center of technology and the use of technology moving forward. And actually, just on that, one other quick stat from today's PISA results: students in Denmark schools spend more time than any other OECD country using digital tools, 4 hours a day. But there will be more on that in next Monday's newsletter. I think it's also worth emphasizing that this is not a new phenomenon. The Nordics have been committed to education for a seriously long time. 300 years ago, Denmark was the first country to introduce a system of compulsory education. And even 30 years ago, in 1990, or nearly 30 years ago, in 1997, Estonia and other Nordic countries began this process to digitize education. And I think it's really important to remember that the Nordics have quite literally been there, done that, bought the t-shirt, as the saying goes, and are therefore kind of rightly held up as being true innovators and true leaders in the use of digital technologies within schools. And I think if you look at innovation generically, then again, the Nordic countries come out incredibly well. Sweden at number 3, Finland at number 9, Denmark at number 10. 3 out of the top 10 from a relatively small, underpopulated part of Northern Europe is no mean feat and no mean achievement. Perhaps it's got to do with the fact that it's nearly dark here. So that may be part of it. I'd also highlight the importance of child-first play-based learning. And this features around gamification, features around games and puzzles in both online and in-person learning and in-person education are incredibly important, and in both in all Nordic countries, and Denmark and Finland in particular have been incredibly clever and incredibly good, I think, at incorporating these into their edtechs, but also in terms of exporting these to international education markets. And as this quote emphasizes, play is a brilliant way to help children to build and to develop so many of these kind of 21st century skills that AI cannot teach: communication, problem solving, negotiation, and empathy. So I think we will see a greater focus on this in global education ecosystems moving forward. And I guess also because of the size of home markets, Nordic companies are born, I think, looking at other international markets, whether it's Sweden's Magma Maths, whether it's Finland's Kiddie Science. Building and developing international businesses is absolutely key. And for many of the leading edtech businesses across the Nordics, their key markets are not their key markets are international markets. And I think the fact that people here are able to build and develop products and services that are used so widely and so universally talks to the quality of pedagogy and technological innovation that they embody and bring to life. So I'm just going to end by looking at 3 or 4 kind of current themes and current hot topics. And the first is, I'm afraid to say, I don't think brilliant news for Nordic EdTech, and that is an increasing role of government. And seemingly everybody that I talk to at the moment wants to know about Sweden and a de-digitization, a move back to print, a move back to paper. And I'm not going to go into the politics of this, but very clearly the Swedish government are moving away or moving back towards increasing focus and increasing funding for textbooks and increasing kind of focus on a kind of back to basics curriculum. That doesn't mean that they are not, that digital tools are being banned. I think it does mean that there is a focus on proving that digital tools have the impact that they say they have. But it's definitely a move away from a kind of 100% digital focus. And we are seeing similar debates also in Norway, in Denmark, and also in Iceland. And I think I'm also seeing and picking up some international kind of concern that the Nordics that have been the flag bearer of digitization are moving away from that. What should we do and how do we move forward? So I think this will be one to continue to watch. Having said that, I think if we look at the new Nordics, in Estonia, everything is digital, and they are getting the best results in PISA of anywhere in Europe based on a highly digitized agenda. But I think in Latvia and Lithuania, we are seeing some really interesting innovation that I think can inspire kind of the old Nordics or indeed the rest of Western Europe. Lithuania have set up their own national EdTech center. They are giving grants to schools and to teachers to buy new textbooks, but also giving them access to digital learning and teaching resources. They are giving the responsibility of choice to teachers and schools to choose what's right for them, their settings, and their students. And it is a genuinely blended and agnostic approach. It's what's right for them that is driving the methodology. And I think kind of moving away from schools and looking at adult education and skills, in Latvia, we're seeing a definite shift in terms of upskilling and reskilling the wider population by giving adults access to digital money effectively that they can use through an individual learning account to address key skill gaps that either business or the government have identified. And I think this idea of giving adults effectively money that they can use to upskill and reskill, we will continue to see that coming a more prevalent thing, given the challenges that we face in terms of upskilling and reskilling employees across our workforce. And while we're on the subject of upskilling and reskilling, Latvia and Lithuania have both undertaken significant programs of not just equipping teachers and educators with technologies, with laptops, with the materials that they need to do their job, but also a significant amount of so-called digital competence training to give them the skills, to give them the confidence, to build the confidence so that they can use digital technologies of whatever shape and form in front of the classroom with confidence and to deliver in a variety of settings, whether it's using them in face-to-face, whether it's using them in fully hybrid environments like this, or in a kind of blended environment where you have some in class and some not at class. These educators across the new Nordics are being upskilled rapidly ready for the kind of future of education as we know it. From a business perspective, I think we are seeing, and I guess some of the pressures that perhaps the lack of funding is necessitating, we are seeing a real focus around acquisition and around and consolidation. So whether that's the Danish LMS Eduflow being purchased by the UK's Multiverse, or whether that's Denmark's Shape Robotics buying a business in Poland, Nordic EdTechs are both being acquired and acquiring businesses as a way of growing and scaling. And this quote from Ben Evans that businesses have three choices at the moment: they should grow, they should be acquired, or they should close, is absolutely a key element of what is happening across Nordic EdTech at the moment. The other element, I think, which is really important to mention, and apologies, these that are in Danish and Norwegian, but I hope you get a sense of what they're about. On the left, this is the move, the private equity acquisition of Uniwise, a Danish digital assessment platform, and the plans from Goldman Sachs private equity to take Kahoot into private ownership. I think we are seeing a significant move for Nordic EdTech to be a substantial target for private equity investors. And in a recent report from the OECD, Statistics Denmark were quoted as saying that Nordic EdTechs were significantly of more interest than their peers in other geographies, because of the reasons and the relevance that I've outlined already. And really, I do have to also just mention, of course, AI. And I just wanted to touch on 4 very quick ways, I think, in which Nordic EdTech businesses are really using AI in interesting and innovative ways. So 2 examples here of how businesses are using AI to supercharge their product. On the left is a well-established Danish principally textbook publisher called Praxis, who have embedded a chatbot within a new marketing e-textbook. That chatbot doesn't give the student the answer, but helps them work towards the answer, and has been brilliantly received by both students and practitioners in Danish vocational education where it's used. And on the right, we've seen, this is from Denmark, but also in Norway, we've seen education institutions and local authorities and national authorities working together to effectively create kind of walled garden large language models. And Scholar GTP is now being used by Danish students to give them a safe environment within which they can learn about artificial intelligence, they can test using it, and begin to use the skills that will be so appropriate and needed in the 21st century economy. We're also seeing, and Sana is mentioned in the Holon IQ Top 50 I alluded to earlier, but is really transforming how corporates are learning and how employees learn within corporates, by bringing all of the learning that a company has and surfacing it to members of that company as and when they need it, rather than talking to 15 people to find one piece of information. Everything is available within Sana, as well as a significantly a unique kind of AI-powered personalized learning engine that ensures that learners are learning skills that they actually need, rather than revisiting content and revisiting tests that they've already done 1,000 times. We are, of course, seeing Nordic EdTech businesses. This is Learning Bank from Denmark, a corporate learning provider, using AI to transform content production. And we're also seeing, this is Astrid from Sweden, we're also seeing companies use AI to transform the workforce. And this is an AI digital coach that's helping sales forces, that's helping account teams, that's helping customer services teams by giving them regular feedback on their engagements with customers and showing them how they can improve and how they can get better results moving forward. So just 4 very quick examples. And one final thing just to mention, I think we are seeing Nordic companies absolutely at the forefront of what I call the kind of future of qualifications. So whether that's on the right-hand side, Denmark's Diploma Safe, and the world of digital credentials, micro-credentials, credentials on the blockchain, or whether that's Lithuania's Turing College on the left, working hand in hand with Telia to build and develop tailored online courses to ensure that the graduates of that course are ready for a job, as it says there, as a data professional in telecoms. And Turing College are one of a number of Nordic EdTech companies working closely with employers and with national governments to ensure that the employees of the future are being turned out through our ecosystem. And I think one final point just to mention, if you had any doubt of the power of the Nordic EdTech brand and the power of Nordic pedagogical values, then this is a quote from Reach Capital, who recently invested, as Eglantine mentioned, in Norway's Curipod. And in their blog post that they wrote about the investment, the first thing that they mentioned that stood out for them was it's a Nordic business. Those Nordic pedagogical values were incredibly powerful. And the Nordics have been particularly good, I think, at continuing to export their expertise internationally. And obviously, I hope that will continue moving forward. Thank you very much. That's it for me. You can follow me on social media, email me if you've got any questions, or that's the URL if you'd like to subscribe to my newsletter. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. You truly are an expert in this space. I so much enjoyed the overview that you have provided us with.
Oh, let me stop sharing. No worries. Pleasure.
And I specifically appreciate you highlighting the importance of impact, right? Making sure that EdTech companies collaborate with teachers, that there is some testing happening in schools so that the Nordic values and the pedagogical values can be truly translated and integrated with the technologies that we have. So a special shout out to all the test beds and who will be presenting tomorrow, including Swedish EdTest and others.
Absolutely.
We have some questions for you, so I'll take them now if you don't mind.
Of course.
One is going sort of back to the beginning of your presentation about what is happening in Sweden, where you are based, and the recent announcements to remove all screens from preschools, pre-K. Do you see that trend being followed by other Nordic countries? Do you know what is happening in Denmark? I can say that in Norway, what is happening is that our Minister of Education is considering it, but it hasn't been formally released as a press release yet. So we are waiting. I don't know if you are informed about what is happening in other countries.
Yeah, I think the slight challenge that I think we're seeing is this debate is, in my opinion, has become actually quite confused. And the new Norwegian education minister has been quoted about saying she doesn't want mobile phones in schools. So is she saying she doesn't want Jonathan arriving with a mobile phone and being contacted by his mum and dad or playing or watching TikTok? Or is she saying she doesn't want Jonathan using his mobile phone to answer a Kahoot question or using Google to find out what's the capital of Azerbaijan or whatever it might be? I don't know. And I think so those two things are being melded together. And I think we are also seeing parental concern about children using their phones too much being dropped on schools as a this is a problem for you to resolve, when in reality I'm not going to get into a parenting debate, but in reality it's a problem I think for parents and schools to work together to resolve. So I think lots of the kind of screen debate has got kind of murky in those kind of broader waters than just what happens in the four walls of a school. Iceland are having similar questions. Denmark are having similar questions. I do think it's worth, my understanding of the Swedish debate is not that they are banning, they are not being banned. I guess when schools or preschools are being inspected, they will need to demonstrate that their tools are being used appropriately, i.e. a 4-year-old isn't sitting in front of Peppa Pig for half an hour without any kind of engagement. So there is a focus, to your point again, on impact and appropriate use, and are we using the right tools that have been scientifically proven? So I think it's that is important, but the clear direction of travel in Sweden, both in terms of government rhetoric and funding, is away from I mean, she was quoted, the minister was quoted a couple of weeks ago about analog activities in analog environments. I mean, the direction of travel is pretty clear, regrettably. Yeah, and given that Nordic countries, especially Sweden, Denmark, Norway, have been
really based on decentralized education systems. There is a lot of pushback and interesting heated debates happening in terms of this screen time discussions. So we'll be watching the space. But another question for you then. Do you see EdTech that are made for school moving to corporate customers with the same or similar solutions? So this is more linked to what you were presenting about the different trends. I have to say, I love the quote about growing, acquiring, and closing. But do you see any trends in this respect, you know, like moving from corporate customers with the same or similar solutions?
I guess the obvious example to this, and I would suggest it is in many ways the exception rather than the rule, is Kahoot. I mean, Kahoot is an incredibly interesting business in that I or you or anybody on this call could use it for free, and schools all over the world do use it for free. But ultimately, and that's where the business started. It grew from that and is now used by whatever 97%, I think the latest number is, of the Fortune 500 customers are now using Kahoot in corporate learning settings. But they are paying to use it. They are paying to access it. And obviously their paid subscriptions are enabling education institutions to access it for free. So I think Kahoot clearly started as a kind of schools and higher education proposition, has moved into being a much broader solution. If I look at those other companies in the HolonIQ kind of workplace and skills environment, that is where they exclusively are. I'm not seeing a lot of crossover schools and no, not really. No. Will Inspera take their digital assessment platform, which is used in schools and in universities, into corporates to help corporates assess knowledge and learning? Conceivably, but they aren't doing that at the moment, as far as I can see in any great scale. No.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And if you think about the other end of the spectrum, because that's also one of the questions about the startup scene. You mentioned Curipod, and we'll have Eirik from Curipod talking on Friday. But what about the startups that are perhaps not necessarily jumping on the bandwagon of AI and are still moving ahead? Do you see any exciting startups there that you want to highlight or mention that caught your eye?
Yeah, I don't want to. I would encourage everybody to look at the 50 companies that are mentioned on the HolonIQ report. There are a number there which that aren't using AI, and I spoke with a publisher this morning who was, and I see in the environment in which my wife works every day that, you know, some teachers are more comfortable at using digital tools than others. There is not the idea that we're going to change behavior and everybody is going to leave textbooks behind on Monday and jump straight to using digital only resources on Tuesday is, I'm afraid, a fallacy. And as I mentioned, in Denmark, 4 hours a day, students are using digital tools. Well, what are they using for the rest of the time? So, so I think we are seeing this is a trend. Of course it is, and of course that this is the direction of the travel again. But I think there are a number of startups that are not using AI on that list that are doing really well. And I think also we tend to see EdTech as being stuff which is about curriculum delivery in schools. There is an awful lot of Nordic EdTech which is about management systems. They are about learning management systems. They are about helping teachers, helping find substitute teachers. Yes, there are elements of kind of machine learning in there that kind of the magic that makes that run, but they are not, you know, they're not based on kind of ChatGPT and large language models that kind of underpin them. So I think that's hugely important to remember, because I think we tend to fetishize the new and the bright and the shiny, when in reality there's a huge lot of great stuff that is going on outside of that anyway.
Exactly. And just like the debate on screen time is getting muddled in terms of what we mean by different screens and technologies, it's with AI, right? Are we talking about generative AI, or are we talking about different type of AI?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, definitely. If I may, just a sort of last question about this Nordic pedagogical values, if you were to highlight a few, you mentioned Lego, you mentioned, you know, like these different Nordic exports. To me, it's a lot about play-based learning. I wonder whether you would agree, and whether there are other values that you see happening in the space as being sort of translated into technologies.
Yeah, I think play has been the big thing that kind of has captured most of it. I'm not sure there are. I guess, and again, there are elements of this in PISA, of course, but I think I'm always struck by how well, and I'm about to open another can of worms here, the kind of can of worms called well-being. To my mind, and from the educators that I've spoken to in a variety of settings across the Nordics, this is absolutely baked in. This is not a optional extra. This is not something that we add on top or build on top. A kind of understanding of helping and supporting, and let's be clear, not just students, but educators as well, helping and supporting students and colleagues to deliver their best work, I think is front and center and baked into Nordic EdTech and Nordic education and Nordic pedagogy. I think in other territories, and obviously I'm British, I have lots of experience of working in the UK, it's kind of a cherry on the top of a cake. It's an additional. We've done all of this stuff. Oh, we now need to think about well-being. That's just not. I think it is so intrinsic and so essential to how Nordic education is run and how Nordic education is delivered that it puts the learner in whatever format absolutely front and center. And I think it's difficult to kind of point to specific examples, but I think that has to be the way that we are with. And again, one of the big things around today's PISA results is around challenges around well-being associated with learning during COVID. So I think, and you know, we're all aware of the pressures on young people, the pressures on staff in education institutions at the moment. So I think that would probably be the other big thing I'd highlight as well.
That's a very insightful observation, and I totally agree. I think the well-being aspect has been underappreciated in EdTech in perhaps other models, but it's integrated if you think about these sort of joyful approaches and playful approaches to learning, right? That it's baked into it, and it's so important to think about it in post-pandemic education systems, right?
Agree.
Because as you say, the teacher, student, technology triangle in there, it always needs to be based on good supportive atmosphere for learning. Otherwise, it's very difficult to be expecting any results. And there are very good studies showing that. So,
agree.
Yeah, no, definitely. Jonathan, you should be able to access the Q&A as a speaker panelist. So if you don't mind sharing the link to your newsletter again.
Of course.
Because it's such an important resource of news. So for everyone listening, whether live or later in the recording, make sure you subscribe, because that's where definitely I get all my nuggets of wisdom in terms of what is happening in the Nordic EdTech space.
Thank you, Natalia. That's very kind.
Thank you so much for taking us through the landscape, Jonathan, and many thanks again to Eglantine. Talking about well-being, we take a short break. We finished a little bit earlier, so we can have a bit of a longer break, which I'm sure everyone will appreciate. So let's be back at 15:15 Norwegian time, and we'll hear Sigdugal from Pickatil and Yngve Lindvik from LearnLab then. So let's have a break, everyone, and be back 15:15. Thanks very much.